Test.
Hello. Hello, good evening everyone. Welcome to our event today. And this is a very special event hosted today by AUC Press. I'm very honored to present to have this introduction to today's event. I'm Thutmose, Senior Acquisition Editor for Archaeology and Ancient Egypt at AUC Press. And we are all delighted to have you here at the historic Ewart Memorial Hall at the AUC Tahrir for what promises to be a very engaging and insightful lecture. Tonight, we are very honored to welcome Professor Aidan Dodson, a distinguished Egyptologist and historian, and the author of almost 15 AUC Press titles. A scholar whose contributions to the field of Egyptology have deepened our understanding of ancient Egypt's most fascinating rulers. His latest work, Thutmose III and Hatshepsut, Pharaohs of Egypt, Their Lives and Afterlives, takes us on a journey through the legacies of two remarkable figures. One, a master strategist and empire builder, the other, a visionary leader who redefined kingship itself. Professor Aidan Dodson, expertise and extensive research have made him a leading authority in the study of ancient Egyptian history and archaeology. As an honorary professor of Egyptology at the University of Bristol, his work has Following this lecture, we will open the floor for a Q&A session, so I invite you to prepare your questions. And there you will have the chance to ask Professor Aidan Dodson all your thoughts about the book, the lecture, and maybe his previous important work as well. And please, before you leave, don't miss the book signing session. And this is your chance to have a personalized copy of this new release. Once again, thank you all for being here tonight. And now, please join me in welcoming Professor Aidan Dodson. Could you please switch off your phones? Or make them on silent mode. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Fatma. Okay, everybody hear me okay at the back? Good? Good, good. Okay, hang on. Try not to drop things. Tonight, I'm going to be looking at the way that Thutmose III and Hatshepsut found their way back into modern consciousness. It's it's important to recognise that even some of these figures who we now regard as being outstanding figures of Egyptian history were for a long time utterly forgotten. There is a huge gap between the last ability to read hieroglyphs and the time when we could once again do so and start to understand something about ancient Egyptian history on its own basis. As a result, the early scholars of Egyptology, the proto-Egyptologists one might call them, were very much working initially within a framework derived from all kinds of sources whose relationship to real Egyptian history was quite remote. And to find and to see how they managed to struggle their way through from those early, largely erroneous ideas through to something recognisable as the history we look at today is, I find, a fascinating thing. And it's something certainly that I'm becoming more and more interested in as the years go by. And those of you who've been following this particular series of books I've been writing for AUC Press will notice the way probably that the area of the resurrection, rediscovery, has become more and more elaborate between the first volume in the series of Seti I and the one we've got before us today. It's probably worthwhile just reminding people who the figure we are talking about is from ancient history, or figures. We're talking about two pharaohs, one male, one female, who ruled during the 15th century BC. And as part of a series of kings known as the Thutmose kings. Kicking off with Thutmose I, possibly of even non-royal birth or only quasi-royal birth, who succeeded Amenhotep I on the throne, then his son, the short-lived Thutmose II, and then his son, Thutmose III, a large chunk of whose reign overlapped with the rule of his aunt, stroke stepmother, Hatshepsut, as one of the small number of female pharaohs that we know of. And in many ways, Hatshepsut is the female pharaoh who defines what a female pharaoh actually was or could be, in spite of the first one, Sobekneferu, having ruled some centuries previously without leaving any particular impact on the basis of kingship. So we have these two figures, nowadays regarded as amongst the most prominent of the kings of the New Kingdom, yet their relationship remains a matter for some debate. During Hatshepsut's lifetime, there is no indication of any issues between them, and even after her death, for something like 2 decades, there is no indication that there was any problem from Thutmose III apropos Hatshepsut. But then, in the last years of Thutmose III's reign, we find an attack on the memory of Hatshepsut. And this is just one example, a wall from Karnak Temple, showing the way that her names and also her figure have been erased from the wall. Large-scale vandalism took place at her temple at Deir el-Bahri, statues being smashed to smithereens, and so on and so forth. But we have no idea quite why that was the case. Why wait for 20 years? If you didn't like somebody, why stew on it for 20 years before you actually do something about it? All we can say, and this is one of those frustrations of dealing with much of history, whether ancient or relatively modern in some cases, we have no idea of the motivations here. All we can say is that there was this problem. There's also the fact that Hatshepsut's name is missing from the various monumental king lists produced in the Ramesside period. And this has sometimes been sort of held up as another example of her having been cancelled by Thutmose III. On the other hand, though, the reign of Hatshepsut only ever ran in parallel with that of Thutmose III, and the regnal years being reckoned were entirely those of Thutmose III. So it may have been whoever was compiling these monumental king lists, but most famously those at Abydos, and this is the Ramesses II example of those Abydos lists. She perhaps was regarded as not being relevant in the sense that she wasn't part of the main royal succession. So we have to be quite careful about sort of reading too much in. There was certainly this attack on her memory, but whether that actually equated to a complete writing out of history is more of an issue. And the idea that it was a case of her being written out of history is made a little bit problematic by what happened some centuries after her death. This was when Pinagem I, high priest and later king of Thebes, decides to name one of his sons Menkhepere, the prenomen of Thutmose III, and one of his daughters Matkare, which is the prenomen of Hatshepsut. Clearly, by naming two of his children effectively after Thutmose III and Hatshepsut, he was clearly linking the two together, and surely he would be unlikely to if Hatshepsut had indeed been completely written out of history in the way that we often sort of perceive her as being. You know, there was something happened, but certainly a couple of centuries later, in the 21st dynasty, the two were linked together in a memory as two great rulers of the past, who Pinagem I had no problem with naming his children after. So we have to be sort of quite careful about that. And also, there's a very fact that Pinagem seems to have been something of a Thutmose period enthusiast, because not only did he name his children after two Thutmose rulers, and they're shown at the bottom as Menkhepere at the bottom, and then Matkare on the right, he also was buried in a coffin which had been made for Thutmose I. So all of that says some interesting things about how this particular period is perceived by later Egyptians, and a whole sort of range of other little questions there. As far as the kings themselves were concerned, probably by the time that Pinagem was naming his son after Thutmose III, Thutmose III himself may well have been turfed out of his sarcophagus and be on his way through the various cachings of royal mummies, which would carry on over the coming decades. And here we've got his sarcophagus, as seen in the 1960s, when it was effectively as it was left by the robbers of somewhere around 1000 or so, 1100 or so BC. Now, of course, it has been the whole tomb has been tidied up, and this kind of view is no longer what we see in the tomb. Also, can you still hear me okay? No, okay. We've still got this echo. Okay, right. Okay. Also around this kind of time, the temple of Hatshepsut Der el-Bahri, which had not really been used as her memorial temple in view of the cancellation situation at the end of the reign of Thutmose III, was still regarded as an important sanctuary. Like other memorial temples of the 18th dynasty, its principal dedicatee was not actually the dead king, it was actually the god Amun, and as such it continued in use, and also became the place to be seen dead in for the priests of Monchu of the Third Intermediate period. And a number of tombs were cut under the floor of the temple and were occupied by members of the Monchu priesthood. And here we've just got an example of one of those burials currently in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, although a number of museums in Egypt and elsewhere have burials from that. The temple's history from that point onwards is slightly unclear until we get to the Ptolemaic period, when the back of the Ammon sanctuary was rebuilt and became a sanctuary for the deified architects Imhotep and Amenhotep, son of Harpu. The latter individual, Amenhotep, son of Harpu, the great official of Amenhotep III, is going to be the subject of a coming volume in this Lives and Afterlives series. So hopefully I may be able to talk about him in 2 years' time, so inshallah. So the temple really has no longer any association with Hatshepsut, but as a structure, it remains an important sanctuary on the West Bank at Luxor, right the way through into Greco-Roman times, this sanctuary having been created during the Ptolemaic period. And we have evidence for it going on into the periods of Roman domination. As far as the kings themselves are concerned, what was known about their time by the time we're talking about the construction of this sanctuary at Deir el-Bahri is concerned, it seems to be getting somewhat garbled. Our real evidence for all this is what Manetho's Egyptiarcha says about the 18th dynasty. But of course we have to recognise that the actual Egyptiarcha, the history of Egypt written by Manetho in the early Ptolemaic period, doesn't survive in its actual form. What we have are excerpts, copies, quotations, which have been left behind by later writers. Excuse me. But looking at what we have got from them, we have got this list of 18th dynasty kings, which it's clearly garbled. There are whole chunks of it which don't quite work in conjunction with what we know about the history. Kings are in the wrong order, year lengths are wrong, which is rather odd for a period, the 18th dynasty, which is nowadays is one of our best known periods of Egyptian history. It seems that in the latter years of ancient Egyptian history, the last centuries BC, it was one of the lesser known in the sense of actual facts. But one thing which is in there, and there have been various debates about exactly which of these names belongs to which of the known kings of the 18th dynasty, we have this, his sister Amesi for 21 years, 1 month, which clearly must be Hatshepsut. The name doesn't correspond with any of the forms of Hatshepsut's name, however, but it must be her. And also interesting, about 21 years is about the time from the accession of Thutmose III to the point where Hatshepsut disappears from the scene. Although she'd only been a simple queen regent during the first 7 years of that, only becoming a fully fledged king. But again, this indicates that whatever had been going on at the end of Thutmose III's reign, there was at least a core knowledge of Hatshepsut surviving all the way through into Ptolemaic times and then being enshrined in Manetho's work. Even after the end of paganism, Deir el-Bahri continued to be an important sanctuary area. This is a map of some of the principal monasteries of Western Thebes during late antique and early medieval times. And you can see that there are 2 of them around Deir el-Bahri, one of them based around an 11th dynasty tomb just to the south of the temple, but the other one built actually within the bounds of Hatshepsut's temple. And here we've got some 19th century images showing what survived then from it. A bell-stroke watchtower made of mud brick, and various other structures. Although unfortunately, when the temple was properly excavated in the late 19th century, little interest was taken in the monastic remains, and all we have is the diagram at the bottom right, drawn by Robert Hay in the 1820s, to give some idea of what once was there. And one rather interesting aspect of all this is the sanctuary of Hatshepsut herself, so probably only used for a very short period for the for offerings to her spirit. However, the false door, which was erased presumably at this time, late Thutmose III, was later on, and here we are at the back, was actually later used as the sanctuary of the church. So the former false door of Hatshepsut was painted with a figure of Christ, and therefore what had once been her false door became the altar of a Christian church. So it's a really interesting connection here of a way that a particular location can continue to be holy for generations. It's just that the dedication changes. And we say a similar thing today in Luxor, where we have the Mosque of Abu al-Hagig in the temple of Luxor, probably on a site of which had been a church at one point. So again, you see this continuity of faith throughout history. The monasteries of Western Thebes seem to go out of use in 11th or 12th centuries AD, at which point Deir el-Bahri and the other sites all lie fairly well abandoned. Until we start getting some of the first European travellers to take a serious interest in the monuments of Egypt, and they start to take some notice of this. And one of the pioneers of proto-Egyptology was this man, Richard Pocock. He was an Irish bishop who travelled in Egypt in the 1730s and produced this very, very interesting book. And it's one of the earliest works to provide a reasonably comprehensive set of drawings and diagrams of some of the key monuments of Egypt. Some of the drawings are a little on the crude side. This is the Theban necropolis, viewed from probably the Nile. You can see the Colossi of Memnon. The Colossi of Memnon here in the foreground. No, it's not. Okay, in the foreground here, and the hills don't quite look like the way you see them today. However, he's making an attempt to put all this stuff together, and also he does a plan of what can be seen at Deir el-Bahri. And this is his plan. You can't really see much. And when you initially try and match this with the remains on the ground and his description of what he sees, it's all rather problematic until you realize there is a problem with the printers. And this is also true in other plates in his work. Basically what's happened is the printers have produced a mirror image of the plate. So actually, if you swap it round like that, it's quite clear what he's seeing. So therefore, his C there is the mortuary chapel of Hatshepsut, later the sanctuary of the Coptic church on the site. B is one of the niches towards the back, and A is the granite trilithon gate, which dominated the site until restoration during the 1960s rather merged it in with the rest. So we can work this out, what's going on here. And then later in the 18th century, the Napoleonic expedition does the first map of not just simply what can be seen up on the temple terrace, but also what's going on in the valley itself. And so therefore we get this, this rather nice thing from the Description de l'Egypte. The first person to undertake excavation at Deir el-Bahri is this man, the pioneer British Egyptologist John Gardner Wilkinson. And one of the many pieces of work he carried out during his long residence at Western Thebes during the early 19th century was a complete map of the whole of Luxor, east and west banks, in many ways a precursor of the Theban mapping project, which has long been based at this university. but just as one man. One man and a theodolite manages to produce an amazing thing. And here we've just simply got the element of it from of Deir el-Bahri, showing the various structures in place. And on the right, zooming in on that, including at the top right there, a plan of the Ammon sanctuary, which was actually excavated for the first time by Wilkinson. A contemporary of his was Robert Hay, and this is his sketch of the Hatshepsut sanctuary, which we saw earlier on, which has actually it seems never to have been fully lost. Now, Hay was one of the last people to be working there as the knowledge of hieroglyphs was first being developed. And at the end of the 1820s, Jean-François Champollion, the decipherer of hieroglyphs, jointly led an expedition with the Tuscan authorities to Egypt, and he and his associates ended up, of course, at Deir el-Bahri. Although by this stage the ability to read hieroglyphs existed, it was still quite sketchy. Although we see the publication of Champollion's Lettre à Monsieur Dacier in 1822 as being the watershed of being able to read hieroglyphs, it was a good few decades before it was possible to read them properly. And there's a wide range of ability of readings of names and so on there. But things like royal titles and so on were understood. And therefore we get this account written by Champollion in 1829, scratching his head, because at this point the idea was that a pharaoh was a male. The idea of a woman being a pharaoh was something which nobody had any thought could be a possibility. But there was Champollion and also Wilkinson, who was also an early pioneer of the reading of hieroglyphs. And they're standing in front of this wall, being able to say, okay, this looks like a king, and then looking at the inscription saying, hang on, we know that that sign is a T sign, which is the feminine ending of things. So when you read this is just one example of it, but when you read all these various statements, and there's a selection of them I've quoted in the book there, you can see these people with the cogs clearly moving in their minds of trying to get their head around something which they haven't grasped. And it takes them quite a while to grasp this idea, yes, you can have a female pharaoh. And there are all sorts of weird and wonderful ones whereby you've got a man who happens to be shown with being using his wife's name in this. It all gets very, very confusing. But it's a nice example of, say, being able to sort of sit on the shoulders of these great pioneers of Egyptology who are, say, trying to bring all of this stuff together for the first time. We then move on for a while, and it's in the 1840s that we start getting a real kind of understanding of the period, which to a broad degree anyway, corresponds with what we think today about it. It's not quite right, but the publication of this particular little statuette in the British Museum allowed for the first time a recognition that yes, you have Hatshepsut and Thutmose III ruling together. Initially, they're thought to be brother and sister rather than aunt and nephew. But by the 1840s, the reading of hieroglyphs has moved on sufficiently that we are able to start doing things on their own basis rather than trying to infer stuff from Manetho and take some of the evidence at its face value rather than trying to sort of find your way through it. One other thing which Lepsius, who was one of the key figures when we're trying to move into this sort of understanding of Lepsius, is he identifies the mortuary temple of Thutmose III as well. So this is a second of the great monuments available of these individuals. Also, although at this stage his importance hadn't been grasped, Lepsius investigates the tomb of Senenmut, the special friend, if you want to call her that, of Hatshepsut. Tonight I'm not going to go into the question of the relationships between the two of them. But he enters the tomb, and from it he recovers the false door from the tomb. So more and more of these individuals from the period are being recognised. So there's the tomb at the top of the hill there. That's as far as on the Hatshepsut side, but also in the 1840s, which is really a very important period in the consolidation of Egyptian archaeology and Egyptology in general. Samuel Birch of the British Museum publishes the first translations of the annals of Thutmose III, originally carved on the walls of the temple at Karnak, where a lot of them still are, but some had been removed ultimately to Paris a decade or two earlier. So the understanding of what Thutmose III was in the military and imperial history of Egypt now becomes something important. The full investigation of the Deir el-Bahri temple, because when Champollion, Wilkinson and the others are all examining, apart from Wilkinson digging out the sanctuary, most of the temple was completely encumbered. And you can see here that only really the upper part of it, and you can see here that sticking up in the middle is this trilithon gate, which was a major feature of the whole of the place until the end of the 19th century. But the first proper work carried out here was by Auguste Mariette, a series of periods of work there, and the first proper publication of Deir el-Bahri came out in 1877. This is the title page from it. And on the basis of the limited excavation, the temple was by no means completely cleared, but at least the basic outlines were made clear. This was the first attempt made at reconstructing what the temple might look like. Even before the publication of Mariette, one of the most interesting sets of decoration of the temple had been published by Johannes Dumchen in 1868. And this is the famous Punt reliefs, the depiction of a naval expedition down the Red Sea coast to somewhere either in eastern Sudan or possibly even as far south as Eritrea or even Somalia. Discussions still continue on this, although I think eastern Sudan is now the current favourite on that. But these depictions, which presented something which had been previously unknown, was really, really important. And very interestingly, the way that these depictions of a peaceful trading expedition were juxtaposed in historians' minds with the military activity set out in Thutmose III's annals, to give an idea which develops further in the 19th and 20th centuries of Hatshepsut being a ruler of peace and Thutmose III being a warlike ruler, and that there's some kind of that may lie behind the tension. Now we know, however, that Hatshepsut personally led a military expedition to Nubia at one point. So the idea of Hatshepsut being the peaceful one and Thutmose III being the violent one doesn't actually hold much water. And actually, when you work it back, is basically based on a sexist assumption that women don't lead armies into war. Well, we now have texts which make it quite clear that Hatshepsut did. And apparently even started looting corpses on the battlefield. If you read a text in one particular way. So again, the idea that there's this sort of the peace-loving queen versus the bellicose king doesn't hold water. We have to be very careful when we make these assumptions. You know, how much of it is based on data and how much of it is based on 19th, 20th century prejudice about what genders can actually do or not, as the case may be. And I think that's really where it's really important for us to look, to be very, very self-critical when we look at our writing and understanding of Egyptian and other history for that matter, how much of this is actually directly derived from the data and how much is it sort of from gut reaction, from our sort of understanding of how history works and all those kinds of things. So we've got to be quite careful on that. Not long afterwards, Thutmose III actually appears in person once again when the Theban tomb 320 cache is discovered, and contained in it is the coffin and mummy of Thutmose III. His coffin there on the left, which has been badly stripped by robbers, and also it seems to have been reworked a number of occasions subsequently by the priesthood before it is finally stripped again and consigned to Theban tomb 320. And if you want to explore the full story of this coffin, I can recommend my colleague Cara Cooney's new AUC Press volume on the royal coffins, so which really supersedes anything previously written on it. So I'm not just simply plugging my book, and also a quick plug to Cara's book as well, which although it is a big, hefty tome with a hefty price, it's worth it. Also in the tomb was found this box bearing the name of Hatshepsut, which at the time was little regarded, but has taken on a rather larger role in more recent years over a debate over whether Hatshepsut's mummy might be identifiable. But there was no issue with the identification of Thutmose III's mummy. Here he is, it's called an unwrapping, but an unripping is probably more true, with his mummy lying exposed in 1881. As you can see, it's not in very good condition. You can see that the actual legs have been broken off, his feet have been broken off, arms and head have all been broken off. Remarkably, in spite of all this, his head is remarkably well preserved, apart from a rather flattened nose. And this head has been compared with that of one particular statue now in the Egyptian Museum to suggest that most of the portraiture of Thutmose III is fairly accurate, including a rather prominent nose, which has been now dubbed the Thutmosed nose. Moving on into the 1890s, a really important discovery was the autobiographical text of Ineni in his tomb at Thebes. And very important because it's first-hand report of what's going on by somebody who lived through successively Thutmose I, Thutmose II, and the early years of Thutmose III, when Hatshepsut was queen regent, not yet a full pharaoh, but queen regent. And this is what Ineni says, and it makes it pretty clear what the situation is, that Thutmose II has died, his son takes his place, and Hatshepsut becomes the regent. Ineni makes no mention of her then going on to become pharaoh, which then suggests that Ineni dies sometime during that 7-year regency between Thutmose III with Hatshepsut simply queen regent rather than royal co-regent. So this really should have settled a lot of the debates about how things related. As we'll see, it didn't quite work that way. As far as more hard data is concerned, finally, between 1893 and 1899, Edward Naville, working for the Egypt Exploration Fund, now Egypt Exploration Society, of which I was privileged to be the chairman for some years, finally cleared it. And much of until quite recently, what one saw at Deir el-Bahri was a result of the clearance and reconstruction work carried out by the EEF. As I mentioned earlier on, sadly, there was little interest taken in the Coptic remains on the site, and the tower and various other things were simply swept away without any kind of publication, apart from simply being in the backdrop of some of the excavation photos, which we can see here. The excavation work here and the clearance and restoration played an important role in the career of a certain Howard Carter. Howard Carter was taken on at Deir el-Bahri initially to copy the reliefs, but also he ended up turning his hand to supervising excavations. Here we've got him with Nabil wearing the solar topee and long and tweed coat that was distinctive of him, supervising work. And here we've also got Carter also supervising the reconstruction of various bits of fallen stonework at the temple. And it was this versatility came out of that which led to his appointment as Chief Inspector of the Egyptian Antiquities Service in 1899, and also really which then led through the career, which of course culminated in the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb. But Carter's work at Deir el-Bahri is really, really important. So there's an interesting point here where excavation, first of all, brings out data about ancient history, but also how a certain event can actually promote somebody's longer-term career. But he was fundamentally there as an artist, and here we've just got some examples of his work. Unlike any later epigraphers who would put tracing paper over a wall, he did everything freehand. He made a few measurements, but otherwise he did it like this, because he took the view that this allowed him to actually get the feel of the decoration, whereas just mechanically tracing something, you lose a certain something. The artist's mind isn't engaged in the process. So that's part of that. Also, something which a watercolour which he reproduced many times of Ahmes, the mother of Hatshepsut, and also larger scale copies like this great depiction of Thutmose I and his mother, Seniseb, which is now held by the Egypt Exploration Society. And also showing he was very much a master of many trades, he was also the expedition photographer. And this is one of the photographs of from the Divine Birth sequence at Deir el-Bahri, which he took, with one of the very, very few, if not the only example of a pregnant human being in any bit of Egyptian art, though I stand to be correct if anybody knows of any other pregnant women on temple or tomb walls. However, in the midst of all this, where apparently with the text of Eneni and the excavations at Deir el-Bahri sort of showing what's going on, Kurt Zeter of Göttingen, later the professor at Berlin, came up with some bright ideas. And this is his reconstruction of the period, which has been likened to a Victorian melodrama with various people wandering on and off of the stage, being assassinated, kidnapped, or whatever. But what Zeter's issue was that he took, because what had been well noted was that Hatshepsut's names had been erased in lots of different locations, some cases replaced by Thutmose I, some by the second, some by the third. And he just took as a rule that nobody would ever put somebody else's name in place of Hatshepsut's. Whereas we do actually know now that actually Thutmose III, when he was erasing Hatshepsut's name, was happier to put his father or grandfather's name in her place, and very rarely his own. But he sort of stuck to this rule, and by following the rule exactly, he came up with this slightly comical, because it doesn't actually correspond with the evidence of the Ineni reliefs, biography, because Ineni makes it quite clear that Thutmose I and II were dead before Hatshepsut has any kind of power. Neville made it fairly clear that he thought it was complete rubbish, and there was a rather frosty relationship between Neville and Zeta for some years. The only light point was at one point Neville's kitchen collapsed into a tomb pit at Deir el-Bahri, and for a brief period Zeta nobly offered his kitchen in as a replacement until Neville's had been fixed. So apparently they enjoyed time at the German house in Luxor together on the basis that the H word would never be mentioned. But then the kitchen was repaired and hostilities resumed. Hatshepsut's tomb was finally identified by Carter, who has a lot of involvement in the whole in all this, in the Valley of the Kings in the early 20th century. The tomb, before I get to Hatshepsut, in 1898, the actual tomb of Thutmose III is identified by Victor Loret. There was no surprise that the mummy wasn't in it, but his excavations in the valley did indeed reveal the tomb. Here's the entrance of it, and quite a bit of material was found. Apart from the sarcophagus, quite a few fragmentary figures and items like that came to light, as well as the remarkable decoration of the tomb with the Book of Amduat handwritten on the walls. It was 5 years later that Carter then identified the tomb of Hatshepsut, Kings Valley Tomb 20. It lies at one of the most remote parts of the valley, like a lot of very early tombs, and was in a very, very poor state, completely choked with debris. It had been mapped actually right back in the early 19th century by Wilkinson, and the outer corridor examined by a number of later archaeologists. But nobody was prepared to then cut through the massive amount of flood debris which filled the rest of the tomb. And it was only Carter who had the courage or foolhardiness to actually cut through all of this and revealed the burial chamber, which he then produced this watercolour of. In the foreground, you've got the sarcophagus of Hatshepsut with its lid thrown off. Also found in the chamber was her canopic chest on the left there, and also another sarcophagus which had been adapted for her father Thutmose I, so that there had been a double burial in the tomb. Moving on into the early 20th century, more material which became available relating to the period came in 1904, when here, in what we now call the Cour de Cachette at Karnak, a great cache of statues was found by Georges Legrand. This is part of a tidying up process, as far as we can tell, during the Ptolemaic period, where tens of thousands of statues which had been dedicated in the Karnak temple were taken down and buried in this huge pit. Amongst them are some of the finest statues from Egyptian history, including these ones of Thutmose III, including one on the right, now in Luxor Museum, which I would argue is perhaps the finest statue ever created in ancient Egypt, although that kind of competition is something where Egyptologists can have a good fight over as to which is the finest statue ever created. But I think he has to be my nominee, I think, for that. Carter, that man again, also finds the missing part of the complex of Hatshepsut at Deir el-Bahri, the Valley Temple part at the very, very eastern end of the causeway there, some blocks of which were recently found by Zahi Hawass as well. But it's to Carter who the credit for actually identifying this bit of the this part of the complex is due. And also Carter, he seems to have had sort of a subconscious affiliation for Hatshepsut, because it's him who in 1916 identifies a tomb in the Wadi Sikat Taka Ezeda at the southwestern extremity of the Theban necropolis as the tomb made for Hatshepsut while she was still just regent, before she'd ever become king. A remarkably located tomb, and the whole story of its discovery is quite interesting because it was found by some local robbers. Carter then pursues them down the cliff, and the whole thing is sort of very much almost a boy's own story kind of thing. But anyway, at the end of this, he is in possession of the first tomb made by Hatshepsut, and also the sarcophagus in it, which is now in the Egyptian Museum. Large-scale further work at Deir el-Bahri at the Temple of Hatshepsut is carried out during the 1910s through to 1930s by an expedition from the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. They cleared a large amount of the temple which hadn't been fully cleared out by the EEF. They also undertook restoration and also dug in areas close to the temple. And in one of those, directly in front of the temple, they decided to remove the spoil heap which had been left by the EEF. And Neville says he made a point of dumping all his debris where he knew there was nothing worth having, which is famous last words for almost every archaeologist of every generation, because underneath the spoil heap, the Met found huge quantities of broken statues and sphinxes. And here is some of the reconstruction being carried out on site. As a result, the Met has a remarkable collection of statues of Hatshepsut, but also statues from the same reassembly process, also, of course, in various Egyptian museums, and also by result of swapping bits and pieces which have been picked up in the 19th century by European collectors. The Berlin Egyptologist Museum ended up with some complete material rather than the fragments they'd previously got. So it's quite an interesting example of international collaboration to actually be able to put all these statues together, because as it's not uncommon that fragments left Egypt in the 19th century only for the rest of the object to be found in more recent years. Zeeta's reconstruction of the period with all its Victorian dramatics was finally put to bed in 1933 by this book, which clearly made it clear that there was no possibility of Zeeta's reconstruction working. More material, and here I'm just really skimming over some of the key discoveries relating to Hatshepsut and Thutmose III. Reconstruction work on the third pylon at Karnak during the 20th century revealed blocks which have now been reconstructed in place in the open-air museum at Karnak of this bark chapel built at Karnak by Hatshepsut and finished by Thutmose III, but later dismantled. And then a further temple, completely never noticed previously, of Thutmose III at Deir el-Bahri was identified by the Polish expedition during the 1960s. And here it is, placed directly above the temples of Hatshepsut and Mentuhotep II. Unfortunately, it was destroyed by a rock fall, one of the reasons why it took so long for it to be identified, because Neville actually found part of it, but didn't realize he had, and thought it was actually simply part of Mentuhotep II's temple. And various items of sculpture came to light, the statue on the right there, the complete one, and also the missing face from something which had been found by the New York expedition many years previously. So some really interesting stuff around there. Another piece of discussion to do with Hatshepsut came when Zahiwas put forward reasons for believing that this mummy might be that of Hatshepsut, found in a tomb directly below the female king's own tomb. This has proved controversial, and although she now lies in the Nemek National Museum of Civilization at Fustat, named as Hatshepsut, some people would still argue she's actually an imposter. So, what I've just tried to do is just give you an overview of the way that Hatshepsut, on the left there, and Thutmose III came back into our consciousness. And they, of course, are the subject of this. And the inshallah was simply that when I sent the presentation in, it hadn't actually arrived in the distributors. So I wanted to make sure that I wasn't having a hostage to fortune by saying it's out, and we found we'd missed it by a day or something. So anyway, that is sort of my overview of the material, and I'm, of course, very happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
If someone would like to ask a question, please raise your hand and we'll get a microphone to you. Anyone?
Yes.
At the back.
I was just wondering, how important was lineage in confirming the rule? I know that Hatshepsut tried very hard to legitimize her rule by visually linking herself to gods like Osiris and claiming Amun as her father, tying her to a godly lineage. Then with Thutmose replacing her name with his father's and grandfather's over his own, was this an attempt to legitimize his rule through lineage? And just as a follow-up question, would you say that lineage is the most important part of a ruler's security?
Ooh, very good question. Very good question indeed. Okay, to start off with about Hatshepsut's legitimization of herself. Now, a lot of this has been built around the fact that there is this divine birth sequence in the Deir el-Bahri temple, which shows Hatshepsut as being the physical daughter of the god Amun and her mother. For a long time, this was the earliest known example of this kind of sequence, although we have later examples. And therefore, this led a lot of earlier scholars to argue that what we've got here is she's sort of protesting too much. She's trying to show why she is a better king than Thutmose. The problem is with that is, in the last 10 years, a similar sequence has been found in the pyramid complex of Senwosret III at Dashur, showing that the idea of doing this is going back that far. So I think they're right. So there certainly is a question of her inventing the idea. However, she certainly is using all the symbolism of being a proper king. So I think so whether she's trying to sort of, to that level, legitimize herself specifically, or is simply doing what a male king would do representationally, I think that's possibly what's going on there. Lineage-wise, it's always an interesting one about how far, sort of, in Egyptian kingship, because it seems pretty clear that the bottom line is to be the son or daughter of your predecessor. But how far there are other things involved there is always slightly more problematic, in the sense that when one looks at the material from the time of Ramesses II, for example, it seems that there are sort of stages of legitimation that clearly that being the eldest son is important, but there also seems to be a phase of presentation to the nobility, and also carrying out the burial of your predecessor. And certainly that Hatshepsut includes that the presentation to the people kind of element in her divine birth sequence. So she's following on that. And I do wonder whether or not the fact that she then reburies her father in a new sarcophagus next to her is trying to fulfill that third bit of the box-ticking exercise of becoming a king by burying your predecessor. Now, the assumption normally is that predecessor has only just died, and therefore you're burying him. What Hatshepsut is clearly doing here is sort of unburying him so you can rebury him again in next door to her. So I think she's certainly ticking all the boxes in what seems to be the normal way of becoming a king. And she's being innovative in that, say, simply by saying, ooh, how am I going to bury my father, given that he was buried sort of 5 or 6, 7 or 8 years previously? Well, you simply put him in a new sarcophagus, and you've carried out the burial. So there's some, yeah, so I think she's doing some clever stuff around that. But I think she's not necessarily testing too much. She's simply making sure that her legitimacy is based on ticking all the boxes a normal king would do.
Okay, we have a question there, yes.
Thank you very much for the presentation. For someone who doesn't know much about ancient Egypt, is there any way of saying something or knowing something about their characters?
Basically not, no. There are a few, occasionally texts do seem to give an indication that somebody is doing something a little bit different from the normal. And certainly the texts of Thutmose III seem to be often more detailed than those of other kings as far as their military activities are concerned. And also there is one text which has been interpreted, whether rightly or wrongly, suggesting that the king might have designed some temple vases. Also, during his campaigns, he also brings back botanical and zoological specimens, which nobody else seems to be attested as doing, which does suggest that Thutmose III's character, there's something about him he's trying to do something a bit different from the norm. So, but that's about as far as one can get, because we never have the kind of memoirs we get even from medieval times about people's impressions of rulers and so on. Indeed, we sometimes are in a situation where we're not really quite sure if somebody even exists or not, or what gender they are. There's one king who recently changed sex completely. We realised that we thought was a male king was actually a woman, which completely changed the whole load of the narrative. So yeah, we've got to be very careful with that sort of thing. And so often you find, as I was sort of mentioning out this sort of idea that Hatshepsut couldn't possibly have led an army because she was a woman. Those are the things which get written in. And also I think a problem comes is that in historiography, often historians like to sort of tell stories, and often they'll base them on other stories. Oh, this is when I was looking at the religious revolution of Akhenaten, for example, a bit later on. But a lot of the narrative people have woven around that is actually to do with church-state conflict in Europe in medieval times, which is then because you've seen there's some kind of religious upheaval. Hey, let's apply that model to that. And when this whole idea about decolonizing sort of ancient history, Egyptology is concerned, I think that's what we need to be doing, is not necessarily sort of saying all sort of Western style scholarship is rubbish. What we should be doing is saying, where do we get that idea from? Is it actually based on the data, or is it based on what is a nice story? Which may be based on a nice story involving, I don't know, Charlemagne and the Pope. And then we sort of move that, so rather Charlemagne becomes Akhenaten and then the Pope becomes the High Priest of Amun. That kind of thing we've got to be very careful of. And the more you sort of delve back, and this is the reason why I'm actually so interested in this kind of resurrection, where do we get this from? Where do some of these, because some of these ideas are still out there and we're still sort of giving to our students. But actually when you sort of dig back, you start realizing actually this is simply something which Champollion or Wilkinson made up almost, or just as a reason working hypothesis, which then became fact. And it's only when you suddenly sort of start to dismantle that, you realize actually that wasn't quite right. Rather a long version of your answer, but that's you.
Any more questions?
How do we know that it was Thutmose III who defaced Hatshepsut's statues?
Sorry?
How do we know that it was Thutmose III who defaced all of Hatshepsut's statues?
Basically because when we look at effectively the archaeology of how these things happen, we can normally tell when things have been erased by what's then being built over the top of them and that sort of thing. Allows us to be quite clear that the erasures have to have happened after year 40-something of Thutmose III and before the end of his reign. So it's a lot of it's to do with walls at Karnak. And for a long time, it was assumed that the attack took place immediately after Hatshepsut's death. It was only Charles Nims in the 1950s who started looking at various walls at Karnak and realized that because we know that wall was built by Thutmose III in a certain year because it mentions an event of that year, and he's built that wall in front of an erased depiction of Hatshepsut, that therefore, he must have done it, and he must have done it after year so-and-so, or before year. It's that kind of complex of events which bring it together. Interestingly, a recent proposal has been that the person who was behind the whole thing was not so much the aging Thutmose, but his eldest son Amenhotep II. That it was Amenhotep II who had an issue. But again, that's storytelling. There's no evidence for that. The only evidence behind that is that this event, that the erasures are happening when not long before the young Amenhotep II becomes pharaoh. So, again, interesting idea, but actually there's no data for it. Simply trying to say, well, it might not have been T3, it may have been the young new king.
Hi, thank you for the talk, very informative. So how do we know where the expedition may have been? And to my understanding, my limited knowledge, the land of Punt, if I'm not mistaken. What evidences do we have that it could have been in Ethiopia or Sudan?
A lot of it's come down to analysis of what animals and plants are being depicted in the reliefs. And people have then say, well, where do we find that plant? Where do we find that particular animal? Nowadays, of course, there's always a problem there, is whether things are living where they were living then, and so on and so forth. Hence the reason why we've got this sort of, it's all clearly East African in some kind of, East African in some kind of way, this kind of stuff. But then the arguments are, well, that particular antelope is here, and it's that sort of debate. It's the flora and fauna are quite well represented in the reliefs. It's a question of actually fixing that flora and fauna on the map.
Any more questions? Can I ask a question?
Certainly.
You mentioned that the mummy that is referred to as the Hatshepsut mummy in Namek, you think it's an imposter. Can you clarify?
This is a whole lecture in its own right.
Sorry.
But basically, this is a problem being, I'm not a dentist or physical anthropologist, but there have been, it's all based on there being a tooth found in that box of Hatshepsut fitting a gap in the jaw of that particular mummy. There are a couple of issues. First of all, there are some dental specialists who've denied that it does actually fit. They have questioned whether there was a bit too much in the way of almost wishful thinking about it, whether it does or not. The other problem is, why does a tooth found in a box with Hatshepsut's name on it mean it's Hatshepsut's tooth? You know, it's very much if you find a tooth in a commemorative biscuit tin of Charles III, is it Charles III's tooth? So we have that. There was two sorts of issues. One is, does the tooth fit? And B, is the evidence that the tooth is Hatshepsut's real or not? And so if either of those problems is sort of is an issue, the whole thing falls apart. So, but it's interesting that the ancient Egyptians thought that what you called something was very important. So it could be argued that as this mummy has been called Hatshepsut, according to Egyptian religious belief, she has become Hatshepsut. I'll leave it at that. Right. Thank you very much indeed for your attention.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Aidan, for a very insightful lecture that also beautifully put the previous research into the new results of your fascinating book. I remind our audience that now we have a book signing session. So if you are willing to have the book, please go to our stand outside the hall. If you already have the book, please don't miss the chance to have your signature on your copy. Thank you all.
I'll do any signing this down by the stage here, so I'll sit down there and then that's really easy.
Okay, Professor Aidan Dodson is in the first row of the hall, and you can come to have your signature.